Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. I have a different type of guest today. He's an author, Edward Savio. He doesn't want to go by Ed. He wants to go by his full Edward name, and he told me an interesting story offline that he needs to hear his full name in order for it not to sound like other sounds around him, which was, I think, a cool story about his name. He's the author of multiple books, and we're going to be talking about some of his new works. He's a screenwriter, and I'd just like to get his perspective on why he wrote his books and what they're about, and that's what this call is going to be about. So, Edward, thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me, Rich.
Yeah. I noticed in your bio, you have what do you call an anti-screenplay, Idiots in the Machine. And you wrote it so that, I don't know, is it a challenge for someone to make into a movie? Or, tell me about that. Where did that idea come from? What's it about? And why is it unusual?
So Idiots in the Machine is kind of this, so if you've ever heard of a book called Confederacy of Dunces, if you haven't, it's for anybody who hasn't out there, it's this book that, I saw the book on the lower shelf of a bookstore, picked it up, looked at the cover, read the back, read the first paragraph of the book and decided to buy it. And I thought it was going to be certain. And it turned out to be this amazing, hilarious book, which won a Pulitzer Prize. And I had never had any understanding that you could write something funny, because I wrote comedy, and make it literary. And so it kind of blew my mind. But it wasn't the book that I thought it was, right? It was different. And I had this image in my head as a screenwriter, as a writer, as a storyteller. As soon as I saw the picture, as soon as I read the back cover, I immediately wrote a story, at least a rough ghost of a story in my head of what I was going to read. And I don't know if other people do that. I know that other writers do that, where we kind of expect something. And I read the book, loved it, but it wasn't that book. So a couple of years later, I wrote that book, the book that I was thinking about. And screenplays are like haiku. You have to fit them into 120 pages or whatever. You've got to have 2 hours. You've got to have this. You have so much dialogue, even right down to the one font we can use, which is Courier. And because they have to know how long a minute is on a page, and that's how we've judged it for 100 years.
That's cool. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So when I went and decided to write something else, prose, I had written short stories when I was younger, and poetry and a musical, but I had never really delved into narrative novel prose. And when I did that, I was like, I do not want any restraints on me. I want to write something that is not a screenplay, goes into the characters, goes into all of this. And I really was like, no, I'm going to go against everything I know as a screenwriter. Well, of course, the natural storytelling and the visual sort of storytelling that happens when the reason why I wrote screenplays, I grew up, actually in 7th grade, I went to writing, because there's only 2 ways to be a director. One, be a cinematographer, or a film, a photographer, you're the cameraman, or you're a writer. There's a few people now that over the years that have been actors that have become directors, but the greatest of all have either really been very, very visual or very story-based. And so when I did this book, eventually my own needs to tell the story and be visual came out. It came out. So eventually this book is visual. Eventually it does have this, but in so many ways, I broke all of these rules and went into the past and into different moments. It was a really amazing thing. And what was so amazing about it is that it ended up being, at the time, my biggest sale of any of my screenplays. I'd sold 4 or 5 projects to studios for, very good money. I mean, very good money. But this just became a 7-figure deal. And it blew my mind because it was this thing that, just couldn't possibly be. It hasn't. So I don't know, maybe I might have succeeded, but it was, we did develop it, and it was purchased by Wendy Feinerman and the producers who won the Academy Award for Forrest Gump and Sony. But so that's my anti-screenplay. But I learned
what
to
makes it
calm it down.
out of the rules that you broke, which ones did you feel would make it unmakeable as a screenplay, and why?
Internal dialogue, mostly. That so much of the story is not in the dialogue. That when we see dialogue, when someone says, a bad writer, not bad writer, an immature writer will write the line, "I love you," or "I want you," right? If you're writing a screenplay and you want to make it interesting or sexy or romantic, you talk about, you can go to the simple, very simple Jerry Maguire thing. It's like, "You complete me," right? He's not saying, "I love you." He's saying, "You complete me." And so they're using different words to say these meanings. But you still have to get them across in a screenplay because the people can't read the stage direction. So
Right.
In a book, what I was doing, and a lot of great books do this, is I might be saying, "Yeah," or "Wow," or something simple in dialogue, but the internal dialogue or the story that's going on between the characters behind the scene that I'm describing is absolutely almost impossible to put up on a visual, if that makes any sense. So that was the major part.
Yeah, I was just thinking about reading a book. You lose the visual; it has to be recreated in the writing. So, I started wondering as you were talking. I guess when you're writing for the screen, it's completely different than when you're writing, for, let's say, just a book to be read or to be spoken. And then I wondered about an audiobook. Like, do you have to now you can incorporate even more things. Like there's the tone and the sound of the person. So it just made me wonder, like, I guess you have to, in order to be really good at a given craft, you have to think about those things that may not be apparent.
You have to think about the delivery method, right? And one of the most interesting things, like, I have often had this, thankfully I had this pet peeve early on. So there is this belief, and it is starting to change. There's been this belief in novel writing that he said, she said is kind of like in a play or a screenplay, these things that we just don't see. In a screenplay, you have the character's name every time the character speaks. No one says that, of course, right? These two people are just talking. In a book, in order for us to know who's speaking, we often say, "He said, she said, this character name said, that character," to help us navigate who these people are. When a narrator is reading that, and if it's repetitive, it is no longer invisible. When we're reading it, it's invisible. When it's being read out loud, it is not. So "I think we should go to the store," he said. "I don't know. What time do you think?" she said. "I think 6 p.m., he said. It becomes this repetition and it distracts from it. So I know a bunch of really great writers that I admire, actually, who have talked about this. I luckily hated that so much. And again, speaking of people who are just starting out, they always want to do the thing like, "Well, I'll just change the word, like he announced or he replied or whatever." Those are things that stand out even more. So what you have to try to do is describe, hopefully, sometimes some emotion or physical action that's going on that the person is doing just before or after they're speaking, which helps highlight both the information, gives us an idea of what's going on and builds a better picture in our head, but also tells us who's speaking by doing it in a more stealth way.
So I guess in writing, it would be harder to have dialogue in writing. It would be easier to, I guess, talk about what one person's doing and have them speak. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how you do it. I guess this is what you learn when you go to a screenwriting school or writing school, or when you just try.
I think it's funny because so much of teaching this type of stuff is not taught in schools. There are technical things that are taught. There are approaches that are taught. I mean, just like you can go to school for English and you're writing books and literature, you're going to have some understanding of technique, but you're still not, it still takes something else. And it's not always genius. It's not always greatness. But one of the things that I like about like what you've been doing with people is talking to different people about how do you get to like, what, I mean, you use the term genius, but let's just call it to be the best at something you do. Right. And how do you get there? And, you know, there's that thing, right? The 10,000 hours, and that's important. One of the cool things that in the Battle for Forever series that I'm writing now, the first book is Alexander X, and the second book is Ancient Among Us, and I'm working on the third book now, League of Old. Is that these people are basically, just imagine people who are normal, or normal in every way, except they are. Some of them are 4,000, 5,000, 3,000 years, and they look like they're 50 or 40 or 30. And when we meet our character, Alexander X, he looks like he's about 15 to 17. He's actually 1,500 old. And everything about him, his brain, his body, his physical and mental development are like a teenager, because they just develop at a much slower rate. They can die, all of that. But there's just this one genetic defect. And for me, what has been most interesting about this, besides getting to go back into the past and into history, sometimes I write where I will write whatever I want and I'm making up stuff. But with this series, I have really tried to stick with what is real and tell true parts of the stories of history that we don't even know, like who actually was the first person in flight and things like that. But to me, the greatest superpower that anyone can have is time. And because even if you're just good at something or average, if you had 100 years to learn magic, like practical magic, you would look like you were a real magician, right? If you had 100 years or 200 to play the piano, even if you were crappy, you would seem like the greatest piano player ever. And so,
well, you also have to. I mean, there's that old adage, I guess, in business. If you've been doing something for 30 years, but are you doing the same thing for 30 years, or are you progressing over 30 years? So, like, even though people don't have, let's say, as much time as your characters, if you really put yourself to it and you study and you try, I mean, you can accomplish a lot within a 10, 20, 30 year span.
That's exactly. And my kids are now 18 and 20. And when I first started the series, they were, early teenagers. And part of the thing what I was speaking to them, right, is that you can, if you just take the time. It's kind of like these characters in the book, they're not the Da Vinci's, the Da Vinci's, it would be amazing if the Da Vinci's had more time, but they're not the creators and the inventors, but they are the masters of these other things because they've been able to learn from the greats, the geniuses. But these people are great because of time. And like you said, it doesn't in years. You can compress it into 10. You just have to be really focused on what you do. I've talked to people, and one of there are, of course, and I think we all, the people who are really good at what we do, hopefully we showed early talent, and even when everyone said, you can't do this, you have to do something else. I know for me, this is what the case was. I mean, parents, everybody was like, you cannot become a writer. You're not going to make money as a writer. You've got to have a real job. You have to have a kind of determination and a belief that is almost beyond reality. And if you look at any of the people that have done some things in life, I think part of everybody comes from different levels of privilege, but wherever we come from, I didn't start with anything, right? And some people start with more, some people start with less, but you can, if you're determined. I mean, determination is really is like the greatest skill I've seen in most,
Well, what, going into this Age X book and the similar ones, like, why did you write them? Why does it fascinate you, or apparently fascinate you, that people that would have lived for 1,000 or 1,500 years, like, why did you want to write a story about people like that? And what are you hoping to communicate to other people by doing it?
Well, Alexander X. So his last name is, he doesn't really have a last name because, he's been around for so long. He's used so many. And so he's actually the 10th of his name, but he says it Alexander X like Malcolm, because Malcolm said, I don't have a name because I was taken from, my name was stolen. And so with Alexander X, with these other characters, there were a couple things that were interesting to me. First of all, I love the idea that someone has the ability to learn things, like we talked about, to get better at things, to progress. And the other thing I wanted is, because sometimes I write ridiculous science fiction, but I wanted this to be fairly straightforward, realistic science fiction, that I wanted to have time travel without having time travel. And my character can tell me a story from 100 years ago or 200 years ago, or another character can bring up a story from 500 years ago, and they're there, and we can go into that moment and see that moment and hear about that moment, and we can look at something that we think we know. Like in the first book, we go back to the ride of Paul Revere, and it's part of the story. It's part of the how we're in the present. Everything is fine. Alexander's been living in a small town in Massachusetts, and everything's fine. He's been hiding out, and he's, the whole point of this story, Rich, is that it's about technology in a lot of ways. And
it reminds me of like Anne Rice and the Vampire Lestat, and they were around for a couple hundred years, and they couldn't take their existence, and et cetera. I wonder if it's very different from that. Like what are some of the things, let's say from reader comments or from people that read this book or these books, they said to you that really surprised you, or you said, oh, great, they got what I was trying to convey?
Yeah, I think it's the deep dives into history, and I think it's the look into history, and that it's also this idea of the future and technology. So you love technology, I love technology. I'm actually more techno savvy than my kids are. In many ways. And I've used technology for all kinds of stuff, for really to make my writing more productive, and to capture more of what I can do, to increase the amount that I can output that I wouldn't have been able to do 50. Whether it's, tablets that, where I can handwrite stuff and then I can have it on my screen instantly, or voice recognition, or being able to type and, edit and see things on 3 different screens at once, and just search for something that I know I wrote, but I can't remember what it was, but I can look up a keyword and get that piece of information. I've used technology. But for these people, they've been great. And then they've pretended to age, or pretended to die, or pretended to just disappear. And they've come back as other people, as other great people. But for the last 100 years, because of technology and photographs, DNA, all of the things that we have now, they can't be famous or great again. Because once they are identified, even if they went away, as long as this technology exists, they could come back 50 years from now and someone would go, that's you. You're you. And that doesn't make sense because you look the same as you did 50 years ago. And all of a sudden they're secret. So the story here, the greater story, is that people want to get to Alexander X because his father is one of the great people through history. And he is trying to stop others who are trying to do something, which is, what would these people do to protect them? How would they handle our society if they needed to protect there's maybe 1,000 of them in the world. Most of them are 300 or 400 adults. What would they do? And my answer is that they would take technology, and they've lived for thousands of years without this technology. They could live for thousands. We have not lived without. So what would their answer be? And that's been the discovery over the first 2 books, and now the 3rd book coming.
Well, I guess it's in a small way, I'm in my 40s, and I lived for 25 years without a cell phone at least, and 30 some odd without a smartphone. But now I'm like, wow, I don't know how I lived without one. So no matter how old I was, I wonder if once I got used to using a certain piece of technology, I still might think, I can't live without it, even though I've lived for a long time without it. Unless I
These
was
people,
forced to.
right. And I think there is that. I think they don't recognize that they have become, over the past 100 years, dependent upon certain things. However, their lives, their secret, their ability to be who they are without being incarcerated, torn apart, probed and studied, depends on whether or not they can. So there is that. Yes, I think there is that irony that they don't know how much they. And actually, also one of the ironic things about the story is that they use our technology to maybe stop us from, right? So it's a story about it. It's got a lot of, it doesn't get. I'm not trying to get into some ethical thing, but it does touch upon a lot of different things that are important to me. I love technology. I also worry about what the future holds for it and sustainability, and I worry about how we are as humans, that we've grown this incredible amount in terms of the amount of people that are on the planet in such a short period of time. And how does that affect us? And where do we go from there? And how do we, everybody's always, I always love everybody's like, we want to have, economic growth. Well, economic growth depends on a Ponzi scheme, which is that we need more people to create more stuff so that more stuff can be bought. So in essence, businesses are.
I think someone's saying we want to have economic growth. I would think, I'm guilty of the same thing. I would think if anyone says that, 90% of that means they want to do better financially. And it's nicer to say instead, we want economic growth instead of I want more money and power and this, that, and the other, So it's like
exactly
more PC way of saying it.
Right. And there's the reason why we have people who have $100 billion or $50 billion or even $1 billion is because we have, 7.5 billion people, giving them a penny or two or 3 or 5 or 10 or $1,
Well, here's something I want to ask you. So this is really interesting. I'm glad we're talking about this story. One thing came to mind as you're talking about these people that are, 1,000 years old, 1,500 years old. I would think the hardest thing for them would be relationships because, I'm in my 40s, I'm married and all that, but if I was single, I wouldn't date a 20-year-old. They just are like a kid to me. So if I'm 1,500 years old, how am I supposed to have a relationship with anybody, unless it's one of my kind? And if I've ever had children, they're so long gone. I mean, it seems like these people would be like incredibly lonely. I don't even know if they'd want to be around after all that time because of that,
Yeah, and that's part of the thing where Alexander's father has, he talks about early on in the book that, his father used, obviously around. So his father had relationships and his father's had relationships over the years. And he goes, about 300 years ago, my father said, I'm done having long-term relationship with women, a couple of 100 years ago, because he just can't handle the seeing them grow old. He can maybe spend 10 or 15 years with someone before, even if he tells that person the truth, he could probably hang out for 10 or 15 years before the age difference starts to be noticed. When you're older, maybe even 20 years. But the younger you are, the shorter the period of time that you can be in a place. Like for Alexander, he's about 3 years he can be in a place. He could pretend he's 14. He could pretend he's 17, or 18 or something like that. That's about the limit. So there is this idea. Now, my conceit here is that although they have experience and a lot of experience, they still have those chemical things, especially for a teenager, that just make it, their brains are not fully developed. And what I call FLF with my kids, which is frontal lobe failure, right? Like you've made a terrible mistake. What, why? Frontal lobe failure. Okay, got it. So for him, he has this. But yes, that is a major thing that, the book opens with a quote from someone who was one of the actors in Twilight. It's a great quote, and it just says, "I would not want to be immortal forever." And
Yep.
and that's kind of, in some ways, like there's there is this level. It's very hard for us, I think, as people who live for maybe 100 years, if we're very, very lucky, to understand where you could get to that point. But I think we can, like you said, I think you can extrapolate. Now, again, their minds are going to be different because this is all they know. So part of that is I've tried to extrapolate how that would be, how their ideas would be different. One of the things that's interesting is that the people that are very old, before we kind of had science and before we knew anything, they actually might have believed at one point maybe kind of they were gods, because they didn't know any better. And people believed in this crap, And
they might have believed that they were going to live maybe forever, or maybe, I don't know. I don't know what they would have believed. You're right. If someone, 500 years ago lived to be 80, they would be very rare indeed.
That's
and
right.
Multiple generations after them would have been dead. So they would have been in kind of that same place as if you were 200 years old.
Right. And now, very recently, the science behind what has made these people like this has come. They know it. They've worked with scientists. They understand. They have their own people that have told them what this is. It's a defect in this gene in a very small sequence, and it comes from a virus that killed most of the people that got it in this small area in this area in Central Africa, and they know that now. But we didn't even, one of the things, and it was actually something that got cut out of the first book, and I'll probably, I've released like some other stuff that's been cut, and I would probably put this together. There's this one moment where we go back to the Revolutionary War and the Boston Massacre, and the Boston Massacre occurred really because this kid a week earlier had been shot by a loyalist. Who, people were protesting outside in the street, and this loyalist, kind of like what's been going on today, where there's these people with guns walking around and shooting at protesters, he shot into the crowd and basically hit this kid in the lung. And this kid is actually buried in the same grave as some of the people that died during the massacre. And this kid, so our Alexander is like friends with this kid because this kid's a teenager. He's about 13 or whatever. And that's about how old Alexander is at the time in history. And he talks about trying to save this kid's life. And he is sitting there and he's talking. He's like, he's worried about the bleeding, and the bleeding's not the problem. The problem is his lung is collapsed. And if he only knew about oxygen and could have just like breathed, like given him CPR or breathed in and expanded the lung, the bleeding wouldn't have been the problem. He would have saved him. But they did not know for another 2 years that what oxygen even was. Right. So this took place in whatever. Right. And so it's like, that's what I love about this type of story is I get to tell this thing where he's talking about something where, people used to talk about humors and all these other things that they believed in that were science at the time. And it was just, they didn't know. They didn't know what oxygen was. They didn't know what germs were,
Right.
Right. So, and we're going to find out something in the future that we're going to go, we were morons right now with however we believed in something. It's hubris to think that we know what we're talking about now, when history has proven pretty conclusively that at every point we've been pretty much in the dark of the truth.
Well, tell me, in your research for this book, did you seek out any centenarians and interview them, or then in terms of the history, how did you go so deep into the history, and how did you find this stuff to write about?
Well, I had it all started out with the dumbest thing. I had a book that was it was the start of something. It was like history we get wrong, right? And it's basic stuff, and it doesn't give you everything, and it gives you it always gives you the same stuff, but it started me thinking about, well, what happened? And I've done some research because I will just stumble across something. Like the thing about who had the first flight, I stumbled across. I was looking for something else, and I stumbled across, this strange story from Bridgeport, Connecticut in, 1903, this newspaper report. And then I followed it where the Wright brothers tried to basically squash information about this in order, when years later when the Kitty Hawk, or the what is it, the not Kitty, whatever the plane is called, the actual plane was in the London Museum, and the Smithsonian wanted the original plane that was flown, and the surviving Wright brother was like, you know what, you've been talking about all these other people, including someone who worked for the Smithsonian who had possible lighter than air flight, and most of it's BS, and we want you to not say ever in perpetuity that anyone had a plane with lighter than air flight before our flight. Otherwise, we're not going to give this plane to you, and we're going to have this plane, and in the deed, it is in perpetuity, and basically the relatives of the Wrights could take the plane back and put up some plaque or anything that said there was any lighter than air flight before their night. And that's not the truth. And so when I found that, I was like, Rich, you asked, like, how did this start? Well, it also started because I knew as a kid growing up, living in New England, that it was bullshit about, like, Paul Revere's ride. He wasn't the only guy. There were three. And, oh, by the way, by the end of it, there were hundreds of people running through, talking about it. So I wanted to follow and tell the truth about what went on, and do it in a way that I could put my character in and have some humor and learn about something. And so then it becomes addictive. It becomes this thing where, by the way, in reviews, there are about 85, 90%. Well, it's better than 90%, but the people who write reviews are always usually, as opposed to give like check marks of how many stars, it's about 85% are like, oh my God, I love the deep dives into history. About 15% are like, oh my God, why are we doing this other thing? They're not understanding that the point of the story is to show all of this time flow back and forth. So if you don't like history and you don't ever want to get anything, then please do not read these, because you will be like, why is he going off on this tangent here? And then when you realize why it does tie together, you're going, oh, okay. But if you're not into history, you'll be like, oh. So that's a warning.
Okay. What's any other comments you got from from the book that really, I don't know, surprised you in a good or bad way?
I think I will tell you one of the funnier ones, and it's one of the ones that I will tell you. This is definitely one of the funniest. So there is this small group of people who are like, it's very small. It's been one or two people here and there, and they just are like, this is a 1,500-year-old, and he's going out and hanging out with a 16-year-old girl. This is really weird. And I'm like, oh, Christ. Like, okay. I'm like, he's actually younger than her emotionally and mentally. And, oh, if you have a problem with that, then you have a problem with every vampire movie. And, it's just like, you're always like, he's not an adult male. There are no 2,000 or 3,000-year-old people hanging out with 16-year-old people. And I just, like, I'm always amazed at that, which is really funny because, and it's true right now, we have stretched our adolescence out. But, you read things like Romeo and Juliet, and you realize they were like 13 and he was 15. And you're just like, okay,
it's all about context,
It's context, right?
If you lived to an average of 30, 500 years ago, you got to get going by the time you're 14, 15 and starting a family. Otherwise, not much time left.
That's right. Or otherwise you're not going to be there. Yeah, it completely. And, and the other thing is that the other interesting thing about this was that I got to explore that the modern family didn't really exist until 400. Like, our idea of this family that in many ways we've kind of mourned, the American family or the modern family is no longer, people are, the two parents, two kid type of thing. Especially it was weird. It was like, first of all, in agrarian societies, you just had a ton of kids to do work. If you were really wealthy, you hardly ever saw your kids because they went off and just learned, and you were just like, oh, okay, I'll see you in a couple of years. It didn't exist. And so for this character, even though he was only 600, 700, 800 years old, where he looked like he was 8 or 9, because they ate slow. because of science. Anyway, so he was doing things that we would never let an 8-year-old do today. We might have let an 8 or a 9-year-old do 50 or 100 years ago, where they would work a farm and do something and, go out on their own and leave and walk into town and get milk or give the milk or sell the milk. We would never let people get arrested these days for doing that.
I remember in my own life, my dad worked in New York City. When I was 11, I would go and, get a cab, go to the train, go into the city, walk 10 blocks to go see him, and then go home late at night, and then no problem.
Never.
I was 11. Now I have kids myself, and I'm like, oh my God, I could never let them do that. But times change,
They do, and they do, and I think we just have more information a lot of times, and I just don't. I think that whatever happens now gets amplified. When something bad happens to a person, it is amplified. Where 100 years ago we might not hear what happened 3 towns over, and we just didn't know about this stuff. And so,
how long have you seen it takes for something that's considered forever to be locked in? Like you said, the nuclear family is about 400 years old. How long do you think it takes for some new way of doing things to become the standard where people feel like it's always been this way and that's how it should be?
I think it depends. I think it really depends on the thing. And I think there are, I believe this is true about evolution. I believe there are, we've always looked at evolution. We always think about evolution as this smooth transition going forward. As, we started out as, amoebas, and we eventually, somehow crawled onto the land, and now we're somehow us. And it was all a pretty smooth transition. But data has shown that there are incredible jumps and spikes in evolution for environmental reasons or whatever, where something happens in a very small amount of time. Very, very small in comparison to the epoch of the world, and even small, within hundreds of years of something we would think is a small amount of time. And I think the perfect example of this is something you said earlier, which is the iPhone, the smartphone, right? Yep. 2007, I did not have an iPhone. I'm a big Apple person. I've been since 1986. I've had an Apple something, right? A Macintosh or this or whatever. And, I didn't buy the first one. I bought the second version. And so 2008. So I was like, it's a piece of crap right now. I know it's going to be great, but it's just not ready. So most people kind of 2008, 2009, when the App Store and everything, that's when everything exploded. So it's only been 11 years, and it has changed everything. It has changed how we do everything. And so I think, to answer your question, things like family and to lock in, I think it takes an innovation or a historical event or a cataclysmic moment. We might be in one again that might change who we are with the current pandemic. And then then we adapt very quickly to a problem or an opportunity, and then that lasts for a while, and then something else will happen in the future. So the truth is that we might think, like, we get into this mode where we're like, oh, we're locked into this family mode of what we do because our lives are only 100 years. So if something's 400 years old, it's been our entire life. My kids, ever since they were 7 or 8, there's been smartphones. So their cognitive growth period, they've always had these things. So for them, that's normal. For you and me, it's like, it's relatively new, but it changed us. For people who are 90, they're like, how do I, use the microphone? And, they're still trying to figure that stuff out. So I think it depends, but I also think it tells us that what we think now, just like that thing about how science, I feel like the future is going to reveal us to be ignorant,
Yeah, I'm sure it will. With the phone example, it's funny, like in my own family, my dad got his first smartphone when he was like 55. I got mine when I was like 25, cell phone. And then my kids were born with phones, in their hand.
Right.
So it hasn't been long, and it's been a big, quick transition.
Rich, have you ever done this? I have done this. I have literally done this. I've seen actually little kids do this, but I actually did it myself, where I have picked up a magazine I've picked up a Time magazine that I've gotten, or not a Vogue, a Vanity Fair, and I've been reading Vanity Fair, and I will see a word and I will put my finger on it because I want to get the definition of the goddamn word, and it's a piece of paper, and I've just literally gone, oh, I literally tried to pretend it was a tablet. What, I was like, it was mind-boggling. Like I went, okay, all right. I've been rewired.
I've seen little kids, touch TVs, or like little kids I see, they think everything's a touch screen when it's not, but I haven't seen I haven't done what you've done, but
I did that. Yeah. I heard it was a meme I saw somewhere after I did that. It was, to a kid, a magazine is a broken iPad, right?
Yeah.
They're trying to get the thing. They're trying to swipe it. It's just.
Well, in Star Trek, I don't know which one it was. It was with the old crew, and they came to, quote unquote, modern times. I remember Mr. Scott saying computer, and I couldn't talk to him. And they just thought like the technology we had was garbage because they were used to talking to it.
They're like, and he actually did the thing with his knuckles. He kind of cracked his knuckles because he's like, all right, fine, I have to do the other interface, the keyboard interface. Haven't done this in a while.
Yeah.
So I have a question for you. I have a question. So you really to talk about, like all of these interesting things. What is your overarching, like, why did you bring all of us together? Like all of these different things?
Well, I love to learn. I love to ask questions. Everyone I know always says, geez, you ask a lot of questions. So, and I'm auditory. So I noticed, I just ask a lot of questions. So I've noticed if I want to learn about a particular field, I go and I interview people in that field. And now I have like some general numbers in my head. Like when I interview the first 10 people in any given field, I'm finding my way. When I get up to 30, I've got a decent command of it. When I get up to 100, in some fields I've gotten up to 100 or more, like then I feel like I can see the whole landscape of that industry and where the players are and what they're doing and things like that. So that's one thing I love doing. Another thing too is if there's anything that you or anyone or me is really interested in, what's better than to talk to all kinds of experts working on that thing and see how each of them do it. It just gives a lot more richness to that topic. Like, let's say you're interested in archery. I mean, imagine going to study with all the top people in the world that do archery and see how they all do it. Like, it would just make it so much richer to you. You'd love it. So those are just some of the things I've gotten, and I enjoy doing it. That's why. And I want other people too to obviously benefit from it. So it's, that's why.
Well, it's great because I came through even like reaching out to you, I came through listening to different parts of like some, were like sci-fi authors, some were crypto, and some were medical and different things and science based. And, it's really interesting to put this stuff together. One of the things that I talk about with people, I can sit in a room and I can go into almost any room and you can throw me in the deep end of the pool and I'm going to be able to tread water talking to anybody, like whoever they are, because I've done so much research in my life over different things. I'm going to know something about that subject that person's talking. Now, it's topsoil, right? It's just the topsoil. They know all the way down to the bedrock, but I can get into the conversation because I have a little bit of knowledge, and then it is fascinating to then hear the rest of it,
right.
Because people will think if you have this vast little thin layer of knowledge that you're well informed. Well, you may be moderately, you may know a lot about a little, but nowadays it takes so much to be an expert. One of the things I find interesting is that we don't have Einsteins anymore. We just don't, because, we can't, because one person can't put together something so impressive, because we have so much more knowledge. There are geniuses, but they're pods. One of the things that, people talk about is, the myth, the Joseph Campbell myth of the hero. Even in this story here, the story starts out as a traditional hero myth with a hero. And as we move through the book, it becomes more of what I think we are today, which is collective here. You even look at the Marvel comic, cinematic universe. It started out with Iron Man, and then it grew and becomes this thing because one person can't do it. And in some ways, that's the other lesson about this story, is that a person, even these 4,000-year-olds who are great and can be, they can be defeated or at least battled not by a singular new upstart, but we must all come.
Yeah. Well, very good, Edward. We got to wrap because it's top of the hour. But what I want for listeners, tell them the various books you have, where they can get them, and a quick taste of what's coming soon. Let's recap that so they can find out more about you, because you're an interesting character, for being 4,000 years old yourself.
Thank you. Yeah, you can go to edwardsavio.com, or follow me on Twitter or Instagram at Edward Savio. I'm a little more active on Twitter. But if you go to battleforforever.com, you can get a free taste of, it's a novella called Bloodborne, which doesn't matter whether you come in before or after the Battle for Forever books, which is Alexander X, Ancient Among Us at the moment. You'll get an idea. It's told from a different person's point of view, one of my favorite. And it gives you an idea of what the world is, and also what is to come if you have read the books. You can read them on Amazon or any place you get books, but if you are, Audible is amazing, because especially for adults, we don't always have the time to sit down and do something. We sometimes will read, quote, while we're doing other things. And the great, amazing Will Wheaton, we got him to do this, and it was a major coup. And as a writer, it's always cool to see and hear something that someone takes your words and they're doing them legitimately, word for word, but they still they take them to the next. So that's where I would go check that stuff out. And, there's also my mainstream fiction, which is Idiots in the Machine, which is fun. And I've got the absolutely not safe for work Velvet Sledgehammer coming out next year, which none of my readers under 18 should read at all. But it's just about it. It's about coming of age for, people trying to figure out whether it's right time to have kids, and but funny and all.
Well, very good. Well, Edward, it's been a great call, and thank you for coming.
Rich, thanks for having me, and thanks for doing this stuff, because it's interesting, and it provides a service to people.
Right on.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.